Let's continue our exploration of feudalism in Europe by taking a look at manorialism. Let's start off with that definition. What is manorialism? Well, it's the economic system of the Middle Ages, and it was based on self-sufficiency. So keep in mind, this is a definition that's based on the economy, economics, and it means to be self-sufficient. So in the Middle Ages, people lived on a manor, and manors were self-sufficient. Everything that you needed was on the manor. The food was produced on the manor, goods were manufactured on the manor, everybody lived on the manor, and people didn't travel very far from the manor. So the manors were self-sufficient. There was no long-distance trade, or very limited long-distance trade, going on during the early Middle Ages. People essentially stayed on the manor. Okay, so it's a self-contained world. First of all, peasants didn't travel more than 25 miles from the manor. It would have been very rare if a peasant left the manor to go much further than that. Also, the lord's manor house, a church, and workshops would all be located on the manor, so all the buildings and structures would be there. Obviously, the lord's manor house would be bigger than everybody else's house, and he would also provide a church so that people could get religion, and the workshops that they needed for doing carpentry or, let's say, a blacksmith shop, or maybe even grinding grain would all be located there. And there might be as many as 15 to 30 families living in a village on the manor. Okay, so again, 15 to 30 families, women, men, and their children, all living in that village. Also, most of these people were serfs or peasants, and they basically had to produce all that they needed. That's what made them self-sufficient. So they had to produce their own crops, their own fuel, their own cloth, their own leather goods, and also they have to produce their own lumber for building things as well. Remember, these people are serfs, so they're tied to the land. They are part of the land, so that's why they can't leave the manor. All right, the harshness of manor life. First of all, there would be a tax on all grain that was ground in the lord's mill. So the lord would have a mill in the manor, so that would be used for grinding the grain. But in order for peasants to use that mill, they would have to pay a tax on it, which means they'd have to give a percentage of their crop to the lord in exchange for using the mill. You couldn't just build your own mill. Peasants couldn't build their own mill. There was one mill. It was owned by the lord, and if you wanted to use it, you had to pay him in terms of giving him some of your grain every time you ground the grain. Also, there would be a marriage tax, and basically the lord could decide who could and who couldn't get married. And so if the lord consented to your being married, you could get married, but you also would have to pay a tax on that as well. And so one reason he wouldn't want people to just marry whoever they want to is that strong, large, extended families could prove to be a threat to the lord. So oftentimes the lord would allow people to get married, but only over distances. And that way there was no strong single family in the village who could challenge him. Also, there was a church tax. They called it the tithe. And the tithe was equal to 1/10 of your income. So everybody had to pay 1/10 of their income to the church, including the lord of the manor. So this is one of the reasons that the church was able to maintain its power and authority in the Middle Ages, is that everybody was expected to basically turn over a percentage of what they made to the church. Also, the crowded and dirty living conditions really characterized what life was like in the early Middle Ages. So, again, people didn't have a lot of good hygiene. Their food was very limited in what they could eat, and it would be very crowded and not too clean. They also had this poor diet and health. As I said, not a lot of food to eat, not a lot of varieties of food. And as a result of that, people were basically sustaining themselves on basic food necessities that got them through the day and allowed them to work. And they didn't always have the best of health. So the early Middle Ages was a really tough time for people. It may be one reason why people characterized it as a dark age. So, what changes that? Everything changes with the invention of what's called the three-field system. Now, the three-field system was based on rotating crops from an earlier two-field system to three. So if I go to the beginning of the Middle Ages, we'll see that people used to plant, let's say, 600 acres. The chart shows 600 acres. 300 acres would be planted, and 300 acres would be fallow. Fallow means unplanted. So you basically are taking your 600 acres and you're planting in half of it, and then the other half you're just not planting, you're just letting it rest. It's important that you let the soil sort of take a break, let it have a rest so that it can replenish its nutrients. If you constantly plant things over and over again in the same soil, you'll deplete the soil of its nutrients and it won't be agriculturally productive anymore. So 300 acres gets planted, and the other 300 acres is left fallow for the season. And then the next planting season, you switch them. And the season now says that the one that was planted, the fields that were planted, will be fallow, and the fallow fields will be planted. And that's essentially how they were able to produce food with a two-field system. But it's not a very efficient system. Let's take a look then at how the three-field system is going to function. We'll use this map to illustrate this. So we see right here is there is a spring planting set of fields over here, and these fields in the center here are going to be fallow, unplanted, and over here are fall planted fields. And so we got three different sets of fields that are all being used in one way or the other. So they're either being planted or they're laying fallow. And you can also see the rest of the manor in this image as well, right? So you can see there's some barns, there's a manor house, here's the mill, here's the church. We've also got a bunch of peasant houses in the village. There's a pond with some water. There's some common pasture areas. And then there's also the Lord's close, which is the land that's used just for the Lord. All right, so if I take a look at this, I can see the shades of color that are on the fields are interesting as well. So this light brown area is the Lord's demesne, and that's in the open field. So that's all the fields that whatever's planted there will directly go to the Lord. And then if I look at the chart on the key, you can see this brown area, the glebe, that's the priest's land. So the dark brown areas go to the priests. All right, goes to the church. And then the sort of middle brown color are the strips of fields that go to peasant families. So you can see a very large percentage of the produce that's going to come off this land is going to go to the Lord. And then another percentage is going to go to the church, keeping in mind that both the priests and the Lord don't work in the fields. The peasants work in the fields, but they have to turn over a fairly large percentage of their produce to the Lord and the church. All right, so how did things change? Essentially, going from a three-field system is going to increase the yields of food production. Notice that I've changed the chart. You can see that it's still 600 acres, but now I've got 200 acres of wheat or rye, I got another 200 acres of barley, peas, oats, and beans, and I got 200 acres that are going to lay fallow. So I still have one field that lays fallow, but the other two are now being planted with a different variety of goods. And what I can see here is that, for instance, maybe planting wheat and rye is good here because although it takes nutrients from the soil, when it's done, it may actually leave nutrients behind that are good for barley, peas, oats, and beans. So peasants had figured out over many years, hundreds of years, which plants to plant in what succession. But by having 200 acres of one type of produce and then 200 acres of another, I'm now actually producing 400 acres worth of produce. Whereas in the old two-field system, the most I could get was maybe 300 acres. So I'm not only increasing the amount of food by 100 acres, but I'm also increasing the variety of the types of food that I can grow. And then the next season, what I'll do is I'll switch the fields. The wheat and rye field will become fallow, and that will then be planted in the barley, peas, and oats field. And the barley, peas, and oats might switch over to where the fallow field is. And then the next season, you would switch it again. So this is going to increase the yields of food production overall. Also, it's going to allow for more variety of crops to be planted. So now people can eat different kinds of things. All right, so in fact, it's going to improve that diet. People will become more healthy because now I can maybe give my horse oats because I have more wheat or maybe the barley, so that I can use those other crops to improve my diet, but now I can also feed my farm animals better, which means, well, they might fatten up my pigs, they might enlarge my cows, it might make my horses stronger so that they can plow the fields better for me with a big heavy plow, which means I can be even more productive and produce even more food. So this is important that the three-field system didn't just produce more food, but it also improved the kinds of foods that people could eat, and it improved their diet and their health. And as a result of that, it's going to fuel a population increase. We see this throughout history. Whenever there's some kind of an agricultural revolution or some kind of change in the way that people do agriculture, if it produces more food, it generally leads to an increase in the population. Consider that peasants in the old two-field system had to work much harder. They would work in the fields all day. They would be very tired when they come home and not have a lot of energy, and they'd want to get sleep so they could go back into the fields and work again. But with this new system, people can come back. They don't have to work as hard as they once did. Their animals can help now because they're eating better. They come home. They have more food to eat. They have more variety of food. They're healthier. They have excess energy. And humans, when they have excess energy and a little bit more free time and they're not so tired, will put that energy to use, basically increasing the population. So again, Europe goes through a population increase during right around the height of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. Unfortunately, this system also is taking place at about the same time that the plagues show up. So the population of Europe will eventually be cut almost in half by the plagues. But prior to that, the population was increasing because of these changes in agricultural technology.